I just love getting sick 3 times within 2 months. So after being shot into space, the Mask of Life lands next door. It's a horrible barren wasteland that stretches for miles and miles. Which is a shame because he could have pretty easily landed on another planet that is just a vast jungle. Yeah, there's a 3rd planet. Okay, I should back up for a second. There are about to be 3 planets in the mix here. The first one is Magna. It's a giant water planet that the Great Spirit robot crashed on. There's just a lot of water. There's not much else going on. The second one is Magna. It's a giant desert full of, well, these guys. The third is Magna, and it's a giant jungle, and that doesn't become relevant until later. And when it becomes relevant, it's weird. We were apparently supposed to have a line of Bionicles that was just a bunch of dinosaurs living on that jungle planet, but we never got that, and it still makes me sad to this day. These are the 3 planets. Does that look familiar to anybody? It's the 3 virtues, bitch! It's been there the whole fucking time! Fair warning, I'm about to drop a Hiroshima's worth of lore on you, so strap in. A long-ass fucking time ago, the planets Bara Magna, Magna, and Magna used to be a single planet called Spherus Magna. Or, in Low Gothic, Big Ball! On Big Ball, there are 3 types of people. There's the Agori, a bunch of little people. Most of the planet is those guys. Then there's Glatorian, also known as Big Meaty Boys. And then there's the Skrull. The Skrull aren't just weird-looking Glatorian, they're actually a completely separate species. It would be like if on Earth a substantial subset of the population were just Neanderthals. These 3 species are divided into 8 tribes. Fire, water, jungle, ice, rock, sand, earth, and iron. There are only 2 known members of the Iron tribe. The rest of them are dead. We'll get to that. The other thing worth noting is that the Rock tribe is made up pretty much entirely of Skrull. Anyway, everybody was kind of vibing until an eldritch abomination named Inanna showed up and started stealing everybody's dreams. What the fuck is this? So this Lovecraftian horror has shown up and starts stealing everybody's dreams and making them go completely insane. The crazies were then cast out of society. Which, you know, kinda shitty, but At the same time, a small group of philosophers and thinkers got wicked smart. So these geniuses decided to do the one thing that always works and has never destroyed any society ever. They created a separate hierarchy of technocrats, scientist kings known as the Great Beings. They presided over Spherus Magna for millennia, and over time they actually became a distinctly separate species, supposedly, which just smells of inbreeding to me, but whatever. Anyhow, their minds grew so complex that the eldritch horror Inanna was unable to touch them, so she just kind of fucked off to God knows where. After Inanna was gone, society started doing pretty well, so the Great Beings were like, hey, why don't we, go to space or something? And the Great Beings then decided that the best way to go to space would be with a giant robot, instead of, a rocket or something. I don't know. I don't know what the thought process was there. It's not a good hair day. I'm putting the hat back on. The Great Beings have decided to go to space, and instead of doing it like a normal person with a rocket or something, they decide to use a giant robot, because why the hell not? So they build the giant spacefaring robot, and you're probably like, hey, that's Matanui, isn't it? No, it's not. The Great Beings and Elon Musk have two things in common. The first is their horrid arrogance. The second one is that their first attempts at going to space failed explosively. The Great Beings pushed this build through the development phase without having a stable power source, and when you don't have a stable power source for a giant robot, that giant robot probably isn't going to work very well. In some cases, said robot might explode. Superman. So things weren't great, and then they got worse, because Inanna decided to make her way back into the picture. She'd been gone for so long that most people just kind of forgot about her and were like, that shit's not real. A huge portion of her victims this time around were members of the Iron Tribe, most of whom went crazy and died. If I had a nickel for every time an Iron Tribe was wiped out in the Bionicle universe, I'd have 2 nickels. Alright, that's a bit better. The first people to discover the energized protodermis were the Ice Tribe. And as any good scientist will tell you, if you're unfamiliar with a substance, the first thing you should do is touch it. The first person to ever touch energized protodermis was Thanos out of existence. Now, the Ice Tribe did the only rational thing a group of people can do once they find a liquid that ostensibly vaporizes people on impact: animal testing. They ended up creating some really weird animals. At this point, the Ice Tribe had discovered a gigantic wellspring of energized protodermis and were just swimming in this stuff. Metaphorically, sometimes literally, I'm assuming. Eventually, the Earth Tribe got wind of this discovery, and the Element Lord of Earth advised the Element Lord of Ice to safeguard every supply they had of energized protodermis and only share it with the Earth Tribe, so that they could both become the most powerful entities on the planet. This would not end well for the Earth Tribe, because eventually the other tribes also found out about this discovery. And of course they settled their disputes rationally. Just kidding, they went to war. Oh, I would also like to shout out Duckbricks, because he's the only reason I remember any part of this story. So now that everybody knows about the energized protodermis, everybody of course wants access to this unbelievably powerful protein shake, and the core war begins. The Earth Tribe was all but wiped out by this conflict. Brief reminder, the Earth and the Rock Tribe are not the same. The Earth Tribe is Glatorian and Agori. The Rock Tribe is mostly Skrull. And the Rock Tribe for now is doing just fine, aside from being involved in a world-ending war, but you know. At some point, the Great Beings gazed down from their ivory tower and were like, oh shit, this is bad. They made calls for peace, but everybody just told them they could go fuck themselves. Instead of adjourning with the intent of fornicating with themselves, the Great Beings had what was definitely a really good idea and in no way would end badly ever. They created a robotic race known as the Batera. The Batera's sole directive was to murder anybody seen holding a weapon. Much like ignoring the demands of striking railroad workers to line your greedy pockets, this would prove to be a big fat mistake. I have no idea why my room is so dusty. It just kind of is. I'm sorry. The core war rages on, and all the while energized protodermis is being depleted from the planet's core. Over time, the structural integrity of Spherus Magna gets more and more questionable. But the Batera are here to fix the problem, and they start gunning everybody down seen holding a weapon. The problem is that the entire planet is basically at war with itself, so that's most people. And the Great Beings were like, let's just chalk that one up to a fuck-up and hit the off switch. But for the second time in as many episodes, the Great Beings are told to go fuck themselves, because like Johnny Sins going after a paycheck, they just refuse to be turned off. So now, in addition to the entire planet being locked in a world-ending war, there's also multiple hordes of murderous robots going around just shooting everybody in the face indiscriminately. So there's good news and bad news. The good news is that the war is going to come to an end very soon. The bad news is that the war is going to come to an end because the entire world is going to come to an end. The core war rages on, but not for much longer. So for the entirety of this war, the Ice Tribe has controlled the largest wellspring of energized protodermis on the planet. However, after a disastrously bloody battle against the Rock Tribe, one of their flanks was left wide open. The Fire Tribe used this opportunity to slide in and take control of that wellspring, and very quickly managed to completely drain it. In case you're not already aware, this is an allegory for fracking. Once that wellspring was depleted, the planet was too unstable to continue as, well, a planet. And it split apart into 3 separate celestial bodies. Bara Magna is where most of Spherus Magna's residents who survived the core war remain to this day. I said most, we'll get to that. So what have the Great Beings been doing in the meantime? Well, because they're so chock full of great ideas, they decided to revisit an old classic, building a giant robot. And now that the denizens of their planet had discovered energized protodermis, they had a stable power source. Let the fuckery begin! Whoop whoop, that's the sound of a giant robot. So the Great Beings have decided to build another giant robot, the power source of which is energized protodermis. Now, if you recall, there's an absolute metric fuckton of energized protodermis, not to mention a bunch of other kinds of protodermis inside the Great Spirit robot. So for those of you doing the math, it becomes pretty clear that the Great Beings are the principal reason that Spherus Magna exploded. Like, the core war, sure, but like, they're building a multi-continent-sized robot that's just full of the stuff. Of course they're gonna drain most of the planet. And they called it the Great Spirit Robot. Anyhow, the Great Spirit Robot obviously had to be assembled, manned, and maintained, and harvesting their own civilization was apparently out of the question, so they created an entirely new species to do it. The Matoran. These little stinkers were perfect hybrids of mechanical and organic life, except they weren't quite sentient. Yet. And they would stay that way for the time being, just wandering about doing their daily tasks, blissfully unaware of the burden of sapience. I envy you. These are like the first wings I've ever done on myself, and I think you can kind of tell. The Matoran are hard at work getting this giant robot up and running. But as tiny little organic cyborg machines, they're not perfect, and every now and again they start sucking at their job. So in their ever-wondrous wisdom, the Great Beings decided to create a director of sorts. Now logically, if you want someone who can get the job done right, they need to have telepathy. And if you want someone who can see what's going on at all times everywhere, you need someone who just has a fuckload of eyes, or can at least decide to have a fuckload of eyes when they want to. To some of you this might sound crazy, and some of you already know who I'm talking about. Tren Krom! I'm in danger. So Tren Krom was in charge of the place until the Great Spirit came online, at which point he was sequestered to a tiny little island in the middle of bumfuck nowhere and more or less forgotten about. Tren Krom never got over this. Meanwhile, one of the Great Beings decided to go full Prometheus and give the Matoran sentience. He did this in order to at some point reveal himself and be worshipped by them as a god. His name was Velika. I told y'all he was a god. So Velika gives the Matoran sentience and then hides among them with the intent of one day revealing himself. He never really gets around to doing this. Meanwhile, the rest of the Great Beings create 3 masks that are going to be crucial to make this robot function. The Mask of Life, the Mask of Time, and the Mask of Creation. We've at the very least heard of all of these before in the context of the Matoran universe. Now let's consider what they might mean in the context of space travel. The Mask of Life is capable of acting both as a defibrillator and as a kill switch for the entire universe. That's pretty self-explanatory. The Mask of Creation lets you make basically anything you can think of, and that's really crucial in the context of a giant spaceship that has a lot of complex parts. The Mask of Time is maybe less obvious, but consider there's a giant breach in the Great Spirit Robot. Someone with this mask could slow down time around the breach, allowing everybody else to move in and fix that breach in relatively quick terms. But it's not just masks like these that are purpose-built for space travel. The Matoran themselves are as well. Right, so all the Matorans serve a function as it pertains to space travel. There are like 15 elements, so I'm not going to go through all of them. Though I will say some of the secondary elements like iron and gravity and magnetism are pretty obvious. However, let's consider the Ta Matoran. They have an incredible resistance to heat and are able to work for longer periods in very hot places. Rocket engines, things like that. Ga Matoran are able to hold their breath for a far extended period of time. Now, consider, the vacuum of space. That might be important at certain points. Onu Matoran all live underground in very low light conditions. Space is kind of just low light conditions when you think about it. Matoran of ice are able to work in the extreme cold. Space is extremely cold. Po Matoran are exceedingly strong. That is just kind of necessary in general. Le Matoran are very good climbers. They're also naturally very fast and also naturally very daring. You kind of gotta have balls to be an astronaut. Nobody had really planned for these guys to be sentient, but the Great Beings basically just thought that they would cross that bridge when they got there. Oh, I forgot to mention, one of the Great Beings touches the Mask of Life, goes crazy, and gets locked in a cave somewhere forever. That's going to become important later. So the Great Spirit Robot takes off, and Spherus Magna explodes. Most of the survivors are left on Bara Magna. As you can imagine, society regressed relatively quickly, and what we had left was a bunch of tribes duking it out in territorial disputes. As you can imagine, this ended in a lot of people dying. Eventually, some people stepped in and said, yo, this is really dumb. There's already not that many of us, and we're all killing each other. This is just bad. So the denizens of Bara Magna developed a system wherein territory and resource disputes would be settled in an arena by each tribe's most powerful warrior. Take all. It's basically like if the United States had sent Hulk Hogan into the Middle East instead of, Halliburton. In these fights, nobody is actually killed. Generally. However, in the present day, the Skrull of the Rock Tribe have been breaking this rule. A lot. And it's been causing some problems. This is the world Mata Nui comes crashing into. Alright, so here's what's going to happen for the next couple of episodes. I'm going to do a little bit of explaining of each individual character's backstory. I'm going to talk about them individually, and then we're going to get into the plot of the Legend Reborn. Oh boy. I'm doing it this way because the story around this time gets a little bit shaky. Bionicle kind of soft reboots every 3 to 4 years, and this was like an attempt at a soft reboot that really didn't work very well, at least in my opinion. So the thing is, there's a lot of characters that come up at least briefly, and then they're just never really mentioned again. There's a whole book called Raid on Volcanus, where basically it's a bunch of the characters fending off a Skrull invasion, and it's really not that interesting. As you can probably tell, I'm not a huge fan of this part of the lore. I'm obviously going to address it, but I'm probably going to skip over some parts because it's just, it doesn't really do it for me, I guess. Plus, I'm a lot more excited to get to what's still going on inside of the Great Spirit Robot, because that shit is weird and it's great. Anyway, yeah, that's it. Ta-ta. Paul analogies suck, gang. So let's start off with Akar. Akar is what one might call an old head. He was a general during the Core War, and he's seen his fair share of, war. After the planet exploded, he started fighting for the Fire Tribe, and eventually became their prime Glatorian. He's one of the best fighters on the planet, but he's getting real tired of doing it. He just keeps winning, and his heart isn't in it anymore. What a nice problem to have. I'm pretty happy with this build. His weapons are more or less the same, I just gave him a different shield.
I'm pretty proud of the arm design too. It turned out more or less exactly the way I wanted.
The legs are, legs. The torso is pretty compact. I wanted to make him look like a, spry older gentleman. Still got a lot of muscle, but he's getting up there. I'm really happy with how posable he turned out to be. I think he's unique enough while still remaining, loyal to the character design. My only gripe is that I used a lot of uncommon parts to make him, and now I gotta wait for his story arc to be over before I can disassemble him. Anyway, moving on. I really wish my hair would grow in faster. This is Gelu. This is, however, not Gelu's original helmet. I do not have his original helmet anymore, unfortunately. Gelu is a Glatorian who formerly fought for the Ice Tribe, but has since given it up to just guard caravans, because it makes more money and all things considered is less stressful. All he has to do is periodically fight bone hunters and Voroks. During the story The Raid of Volcanus, he ends up playing a pivotal role in defending the city. He manages to steal the Skrull's battle plans from a bone hunter, and unites a whole bunch of Glatorian to defend the city. And then he disappears in any relevant way from the lore until much, much later. We'll get to that, don't worry about it. You may have noticed a trend. I like making my ice boys tall. Something about it just makes sense to me.
His torso's pretty big and bulky. I'm very happy with how it turned out.
This is unfortunately not on solidly. It moves around a lot, but that's alright. It's a bummer that this story around this guy wasn't really fleshed out. Like I said, I'm a huge fan of the 2009 sets, not a huge fan of the story. Anyway. Strack is also a character in this story. Strack's character can pretty easily be summed up as slimy, self-interested dillhole. He pulls a fast one on Akar later in the story when they're in the arena together. And it takes way more convincing from Gelu to get him to defend Volcanus than it should. He's not super relevant to the story, but he's a really cool-looking character.
Come on, look at that face. Just look at that face!
So like I said, I like making my icy boys tall, and I made no exception for Strack. I also gave him heels, because anybody who can fight in heels is a registered bad bitch. The arms look pretty big and bulky without having to add that much armor. This is why these, ice spikes are kind of awesome as armor. As you can probably tell, I had a lot of fun with this torso. It's pretty unorthodox. I used a Borok body to give him his signature hunch, and then I also gave him some spines, because I think that was missing from the original character. Just More spikes. Also something worth noting, in the movie Strack has an Eastern European accent while every other Ice Tribe character has an American accent, and I just think that's hilarious. Anyway. Oh shit, so let's talk about Gresh. Gresh is a young Glatorian, and as such, he's a novice fighter. But would you believe me if I told you that young in this context meant approximately 100,000 years old? Like, what? Okay, so Gresh is kind of a good example as to why a lot of 2009's story just doesn't really work, because it's not very well thought out. Like, if you're alive for 100,000 years and you do one thing and you're still a novice at it, you're a fucking idiot. Like, it's kind of hard to do young characters when all of these characters are, like, thousands and thousands of years old at the very least. Anyway, I could rant about this forever. Let me get into the build. The legs and arms are pretty simple, nothing too crazy there. The torso is very thin, which I think works for Gresh's character. It kind of evokes a sort of youngness. Anyway, I'm happy enough with this build. I hope you guys like it. Let's move on. This is my dinner. And these are Kina and Barracks. Barracks would call himself a collector, but he's actually just a thief. Unlike, I think, most of the Bionicle fans, I actually like this little stinker. I think he's fun. This is Kina. Kina is an ancient astronaut theorist. Kina genuinely believes that there's a bunch of aliens out there that are just waiting to make contact with them. She has no idea how right she is. Except she might, because she did find a giant hole in a mountain that has a bunch of cave drawings in it that might confirm exactly what she believes. Anyway, the build for Kina is pretty consistent with the original. I didn't have all the fin pieces I needed to make her armor, like, entirely fin pieces like it originally was, so I just didn't do that. As a result, her armor's a little bit more understated, except for, like, the translucent neon yellow stuff. I just added that for accents because I think it looks cool. The torso is pretty much identical to the original build. I actually like the original build a lot. I think it's really inventive. And then Barracks is really just a very basic, you know, Matoran build. Don't forget to floss! This is Malum. Malum is one of my favorite 2009 characters, which is unfortunate because he gets, like, the least attention. He now no longer is, and there's a very good reason for that. The Glatorian arena has a very strict no-kill rule. At some point, Malum ceased to respect this rule. It got so bad that Malum almost murdered Gresh, but Akar stepped in and saved the little guy's life. At which point, Malum was exiled from the Fire Tribe. But being the resourceful bastard that he is, Malum was not going to let his time wasting away in the desert go to, well, waste. What had happened was he ran across a tribe of Voroks and he made every single one of them his bitch. They now recognize Malum as the Alpha. Malum is now the leader of a tribe of bug demons. I fucking love this character. Though his appearances in the lore are pretty brief, his story is just phenomenal. I wish more of the characters in 2009 were like Malum, and I really wish Malum had shown up in the Legend Reborn, the 4th movie, but he just doesn't. Well, I mean, he sort of does, but not really. Watch the movie, you'll see what I mean. I put a lot of work into this build. Arms and legs are simple and relatively close to the original because, I mean, I do like the original set. The body also isn't that far off, all things considered. Size-wise, at least. In terms of parts, it is very different.
Here's what it looks like inside if I take off the chest plate. I don't know if you guys can really see what's going on, but I hope you can, because I'm very happy with it.
Malum is one of the characters I think I'm going to keep assembled after I finish the 2009 story, at least for a while. He's my favorite. My goddamn lip is still fucked up. So you know what time it is? That's right, for the 4th and final time, it's time to talk about one of the movies, The Legend Reborn. This 4th movie follows Mata Nui once he reaches Bara Magna. Now, it's been a long time since that last movie, and in the meantime, Bionicle film production has switched companies. I don't remember from where to what. I think it's from Miramax to something else, but regardless, you can tell. There are some major differences. For one, and I think this is a little bit of a contentious point, I believe that the animations are actually better in The Legend Reborn. They're more loyal to the sets, there's more detail in the motion, like, you'll see when you watch it, the animations are actually pretty good. The voice acting talent has also changed, and it's gotten pretty good. Like, Michael Dorn plays Mata Nui. If anybody watches Star Trek, you know that that's pretty awesome. But aside from that, everything else has gotten worse. And you'll see what I mean as I continue to talk about this. Ah, did I scare you? So like I said, there are some things about Legend Reborn that are wonderful, and there are some things that are just fucking terrible. And the first thing worth mentioning is the sound effects. Like, there's at least one point I can remember clearly. There's a bunch of others, but I remember at one point very clearly, there's that iMovie violin sting that you can get. It's like Scared Effect 1 or whatever it is. Hang on, where's my laptop? That! And there's a bunch of other stuff like that. Like, there's a point where Akar kicks Strack, and you just hear, like, a stock impact noise. Like, now, first of all, it's a really bad-sounding sound effect. Like, it sounds like they literally just dropped an MP3 in there and didn't even bother mixing it. It's also not what it would sound like if you kicked a largely metallic cyborg. Like, if a metal foot hits metal armor, you're not going to get, like, a meaty impact sound. This problem persists throughout the entire movie. Bionicle, the Legend Reborn. So the first thing that happens is we have a significantly less high-budget animation of the Great Spirit robot coming out of the water. And then we have an actually kind of dope animation of a bunch of Matoran bumming around inside the Great Spirit robot doing their thing. And then there's the whole, oh, eyes turn red, Madanui gets shot out of the chest, yada yada yada. So Madanui gets shot out into space and crash lands in the desert of Bara Magna. He then makes himself a new body out of sand. He then makes friends with a bug that transforms into a weapon for him. The weapon doesn't actually look like this. I just prefer stabs to whatever the hell he was doing in the movie. He then gets attacked by a bug demon. So he frightens it off by breaking off its tail and using it as a sword. And then this guy shows up. This is Metis, and he's basically Vince McMahon if Vince McMahon was an even shadier capitalist. His whole job is basically training and renting out new Glatorian. And he sees Madanui as a prime candidate, so he snatches him up and brings him to the Fire Tribe. Okay, I will say, even with all its issues, the Legend Reborn is still pretty based. Anyway, Metis and Madanui arrive at a coliseum in the Fire Tribe, where Akar is busy fighting Strack. Akar wins. Strack doesn't like this and tries to pull some sneaky shit while Akar has his back turned. But Madanui steps in and beats the shit out of Strack. Madanui manages to get away from Metis to go hang out with Akar. He's also at this point gotten the rundown on how the whole Glatorian system works, and he's like, well, that's kind of weird, but alright. So Akar then explains to Madanui how boring it is and how much his life sucks because he keeps winning all the time, yada yada yada. And Madanui explains to him that he's an alien, and well, I mean, that is kind of a huge bombshell, right? Then Kina, the ancient astronaut theorist, kind of just pops out of nowhere and is like, yes, I was right! Hey, alien guy, do you want to come to my underground cave where I found a bunch of really weird shit that's pretty dope? Sweet, let's go to my village! So they pile into a vehicle that's essentially a land-based reimagining of one of the flying things from last year, and they're off. Strack should have gotten more screen time, honestly. So the gang heads to Kina's village. On the way, they fight and defeat a bunch of bone hunters and a giant scorpion that isn't pictured here. When they finally arrive at Kina's village, they find it entirely destroyed. They also find Barracks. They discover that the city was destroyed by an unlikely alliance between Skrull and bone hunters. For clarification, though they may look similar, Skrull and bone hunters are actually very different. Bone hunters are just weird Agori that decided to become bounty hunters and live in the middle of the desert and just suck. The Skrull are the members of the Rock Tribe, and they are actually genetically distinct from both Agori and Glatorian. They're allied under the purview of a very buff Skrull named Tuma, who is for some reason also the only one who speaks English. This is not what Tuma looks like, this is one of my Toa, but he's gonna serve as a stand-in nonetheless. Because he's green just like Tuma, even though Tuma's a Skrull and the Bone Hunters are green, and the Bone Hunters aren't supposed to be Skrull, but Tuma's green and he's a Skrull, and this year's plot was not well thought out. Alright, so from this point on, the movie is relatively straightforward and not all that much happens, so we're gonna speed through it a little bit. The gang finds Gresh in the ruins. He's badly wounded, but they manage to patch him up. Kina shows Madanui the cave that she found, and Madanui's like, yeah, wow, this shit do be old. Also, there's probably some crucial information pertaining to my origins, but, well, you know, whatever. Madanui gives all of his friends elemental powers because that's just a thing that he can do now. The gang comes to the realization that given that the fact that the Skrull are just attacking everywhere now, somebody's probably on the inside as a traitor feeding information to Tuma and his lackeys. But whomst? Madanui meets Terex and Vastus, two old heads who have been fighting forever, and he's like, yeah, no, we're gonna enlist you too, and he gives them elemental powers as well. Yo, this is friggin' sick, Vastus said, probably. Somewhere along the line, Kina and Barracks both get kidnapped by the Skrull. Madanui sets out on his own to find them, leaving the rest of the Glatorian to guard their villages from potential Skrull attacks. Madanui manages to track down the whereabouts of Kina and Barracks somehow, and winds up face to face with the almighty Tuma in the process. That's literally what he sounds like, I'm not even exaggerating. And he challenges him to a duel. He wins, it's barely even a contest. Then Metis steps out of the shadows and is like, well done. As it turns out, Tuma was only sort of in charge. He was the one with the spirit and kind of the motivation to lead the Skrull to victory, but Metis was kind of, I guess, a good chunk of the brains and also the kind of financial incentive behind the whole thing. The whole financial angle of this is never really explained, but they just paint him as like an evil capitalist, which, you know, I'm here for. Metis is like, so now you know this, that's great, but it's too bad you'll never be able to tell anybody because I'm just gonna sick the entire Skrull army on you. And it seems like Madanui is turbo fucked. But I think you all know what's about to happen. Friends are here to save the day. I think my Skrull model turned out pretty good, honestly. I like this guy a lot. So in the chaos of the battle, Metis tries to make his escape. But Madanui catches up to him. And he says, now people will see you for what you really are. And turns Metis into a snake. Turning a greedy capitalist into a snake is just 10 out of 10. Great. Awesome. So the good guys win and the movie's basically over at this point. But the way the movie ends is weird. It cuts to some undetermined point in the future where ostensibly the Skrull threat has been eradicated and all the other tribes have been united under one person, Akar. and all the different villages are being physically dragged together. Which might seem weird until you realize that all of the different villages are actually sitting within the different parts of that gigantic robot that exploded eons ago. Which I guess is kind of a cool idea, but it brings up a very particular problem that I am about to address as soon as this video ends and the next one starts. This video is going to be a little bit different. As you guys know, I really love Bionicle. I think it's one of the greatest sci-fi universes to ever come into existence. Definitely the best one to come into existence in the last quarter century. That being said, the Bionicle universe does have one major issue, and it's scale. There are plenty of sci-fi universes that kind of have this issue a little bit. 40K does, but the thing is, the scale in 40K is just played for laughs because, oh, everything is fuck off huge. It's great. I love that. The thing is, in the Bionicle universe, it does actually kind of become a problem. And it becomes a problem in two major ways. It's both, you know, actual size scaling and temporal scaling. I'm going to talk about the size scaling first. As I addressed earlier, as it pertains to the two, like, multi-continent sized robots, the fourth Bionicle movie just gets the scaling completely wrong. The thing is, in the Bionicle storyline, there's actually some debate as to how big these robots actually are. Greg Farshty and Christian Faber, the two kind of main creative minds behind Bionicle, actually have different ideas of how big this robot is supposed to be. Christian Faber has a more conservative and I would say a more, you know, air quotes, realistic perspective on the size of it, and I tend to agree with his measurements more. But I would argue that the real issue arises when we get to Bara Magna. Because the thing is, Bara Magna it's a planet. It's supposed to be huge, but it doesn't really come off that way in the story, and when you look at the maps, the area is just, it's very small. And the thing is, there's also, like, just not a lot of people on the planet. Like, I mean, I get that there was supposed to be this huge mass extinction event, but even so, like, just having, like, what feels sometimes just like 12 people on this entire planet it doesn't quite feel right, you know? And honestly, other science fiction universes kind of run into this problem too, especially, like, you know, with Star Trek, where they're like, we're investigating this entire planet, and then they only really spend their time in, like, one place. Like, I get that there's only so much you can do when you have to, like, kind of sum up an entire planet for a science fiction universe, but still. And then at the other end of all of this, there's also something that needs to be considered, which is scale creep. Anybody who plays 40K is probably going to be sort of aware of this problem. I think the best example of it is the difference between the Tau and the Space Marines, where the Space Marines are supposed to be, like, 8 feet tall, and the Tau are really only supposed to be, like, 5 to 5.5 feet tall, but on the tabletop, they end up being, like, approximately the same height. Bionicle has actually kind of the opposite problem. Like, over time, the builds got more complex, and they just kind of got bigger, when canonically, they were supposed to kind of remain the same size as the original builds. Like, in the canon, these two are kind of supposed to be the same height, but they're, you know, they're not. But honestly, this isn't as big of an issue compared to the temporal scaling, and in the next video, I'm going to talk about that, because there's a lot of dimensions to it that I don't think I want to just sum up in the, you know, 40 seconds I have left here. Yes. So the size-based scaling in the Bionicle universe is actually not, like, the biggest issue. The biggest issue is how the Bionicle universe deals with time, which I'm just referring to as temporal scaling. Like, if you'll remember, the first flashback we had was, like, 1,000 years, and then there was one after that that was 4,000 years, and then there was one after that that was, like, 80,000 years plus. Like, okay, in the main storyline, in, like, the A-plot, in between, like, present day and the Toa Metru's storyline, like, in the 1,000 years between that, like, pretty much nothing really happens. Then when we get to read the Mutron Chronicles, we find out that there are just, like, millennia upon millennia where, like, he basically says that, like, literally nothing happens. There's just these long swaths of time where, like, at the very least in the main story, and sometimes just overall, like, nothing happens. Additionally, it's worth considering that Akar is probably the same age and maybe even older than Tren Krom, which just contextually feels kind of ridiculous to say. It's kind of like if you found out that your dad was older than Cthulhu. It's also worth considering that, like, Gresh has been alive for, like, tens of millennia, and he's somehow still, like, a novice fighter. Like, dude, get it together. But all of this would be more or less excusable if it wasn't for the fact that, like, the present-day A-plot takes place in such a short span of time. Like, okay, the fact is that everything that happens from the Toa Mata arriving on Mata Nui to the eventual end of the main storyline that we're getting to, it all happens within about the span of, like, 1.5 to 2 years. And that's the thing, right? Like, the bulk of this story that stretches over, like, tens of thousands of years happens within, like, a year and a half. And all things considered, this isn't actually, like, game-breaking or whatever. Just like the scaling issues aren't game-breaking either. It just seems like a major oversight, you know? That being said, the kind of level of absurdity that comes with it also adds to the mystique of the universe a little bit, I think. So there's two sides that you can view this from. It's really only in 2009 that these things become an issue in a way that, like, screws with the story at all, you know? Outside of that, the story's just as beautiful as it's always been. And I love my little plastic people. My seasonal allergies are kicking in. I've been keeping you guys in the dark on the Red Star, and it's time that changes. Because now that we know that Mata Nui is a giant robot, we can start expanding on what the hell everything else is. The Red Star has been around from the very beginning. In like the very first scene of the Mata Nui online game, you can look through a telescope and you can see the Red Star. At one point, Gally's looking through the telescope and she sees something alive on the Red Star. And then she gets scooped up by a teleporting giant and it's never brought up again. But yes, what Gally saw was correct. There is something alive on the Red Star. So the Red Star is probably not a star then, right? No, it is not. And it's also no moon. It's a space station. To be more precise, it's a giant satellite. So why the hell is it there? The only thing of significance in the main story that we know of it doing is turning a bunch of Matoran into the Toa Inika. Would it help to clarify things if I told you it was full of zombies? Here we go, getting into some freaky shit. So, the Red Star. When a denizen of the Matoran universe would die, their body would be transported up to the Red Star. Up top, it would either be repaired and sent back down, or the soul would be transplanted into another body, usually in both cases with the memory wiped. And that seems pretty cool, right? Right? Wrong. Because a little while ago, the same thing happened to the Red Star that usually happens to a combination hookah and coffee maker. It broke. And who do we have to thank for the totaling of this miraculous resurrection machine? Well, the Ninra Ghosts. In case you forgot, the Ninra Ghosts are made up of mostly Matoran of Iron, who are a bunch of mad scientists and gun nuts. The Ninra Ghosts have invented a number of things, including the Midak Sky Blaster, the Ninra Ghost Blaster, the Mask of Elemental Energy, and the Toa Suva, I think. However, one instance in which they really fucked up was creating someone named Gardas. I actually found a Ghost Blaster that shoots well. Alright, so who's Gardas? This is Gardas. So how does this ugly motherfucker relate to the Red Star? Well, Gardas used to be an entirely normal Matoran until the Ninra Ghosts decided to experiment on him a whole bunch. At one point or another, Gardas died. His body was then sent up to the Red Star. Now, the experimentation had made him so unrecognizably fucked up that the Red Star had no idea what to do with him. The Red Star did its best to repair him and then spit him back out onto the mortal plane. But Gardas was such a genetic mess that when he went through the teleporter to go back to the Matoran universe, the teleporter just completely shat itself. So now, anybody that dies in the Matoran universe gets transported up to the Red Star, potentially gets repaired, but does not get sent back down. So essentially anybody who's died inside the Great Spirit robot is trapped on the Red Star forever.